tonight, as you know, deals with American policy, or this afternoon, with the Middle East and the question of hope for the future. It couldn't be more exciting, unfortunately, because with that excitement goes a lot of fear and trembling and potential tragedy, and some very real tragedy. But on the most serious level, it's a challenge to American statesmanship and wisdom, and to the wisdom of statesmen in the entire region. So the topic is a most serious one, and we're absolutely delighted to address it, to be joined by the senior State Department officer responsible for the region, William J. Burns. Secretary Burns received his undergraduate training at LaSalle University, his Master of Philosophy and his Doctor of Philosophy from Oxford University, where he studied as a Marshall Scholar. He's published a book, Foreign Aid and American Policy in Egypt, 1955 to 1981. Joined the State Department in 1982. Had several staff positions both in the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs and with the Deputy Secretary of State. He was advisor to the President and primary director for Near Eastern and South Asian affairs at the National Security Council. He served as executive secretary of the State Department itself, and he served as a special assistant to the Secretary of State. His last assignment, among his overseas assignments, has been foreign political officer in Amman and the same kind of a position in Moscow. And then before his present position, he was ambassador to the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. And at present, as we all know, he's Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs. It's my enormous pleasure to present to you William J. Burns.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And it really is an honor to be here with all of you this afternoon. There are a lot of different strategies for appearing before a group as formidable and as well-informed as all of you are. Mark Twain, I'm told, had a simple approach. "It is my custom," he said, "to keep talking until I have the audience cowed." Well, I'll try to spare you that particular strategy this afternoon. But we do live in interesting times, and I'll cover as much ground as I can without wearing out my welcome. Early in my career, I had the good fortune to work for then Secretary of State James Baker. Those were remarkable days. I vividly remember sitting behind him in our delegation to the Madrid Middle East Peace Conference almost exactly 11 years ago. The hall that day was electric with a sense of possibility. That was a time of hope for the entire Middle East. The international community had just rolled back Iraq's aggression against Kuwait. The Cold War was over, and the United States and Russia were joined together in common cause. Arabs and Israelis dared to believe that long-standing disputes were on the brink of resolution. The possibilities truly seemed endless. Sadly, the years since then have not brought the region's hopes to fruition. Political and economic systems have stagnated. The essential bargain between Arabs and Israelis, that a fair settlement of their conflict could be achieved, but only through negotiations and not violence or intimidation, and that both sides had a mutual interest in confronting militancy, has broken down. Meanwhile, Saddam Hussein's regime continues its brutal repression of the Iraqi people, even as it continues to evade its UN-mandated obligation to disarm. Violent extremist groups with global reach have launched murderous attacks against us and against our friends. As a result, anger and frustration stalk the Middle East today, as too many people across the region are starved of present prospects and future hopes. In their discontent, the peoples of the Middle East yearn for change, but at the same time they are weary of it, having learned from bitter experience that change can bring uncertainty, dislocation, and alienation as often as greater well-being. Some observers may be tempted to pull back and let the societies in the region struggle alone. But the cold truth is that a Middle East mired in internal conflict is a threat to the American people as much as it is to the people of the region. The Middle East is home to some of our closest friends, 2/3 of world oil reserves, and the terrorists of September 11th. The stakes are high, and inaction would be catastrophic. The United States, the international community, and our friends in the region have a strong interest in rekindling hope with a positive agenda founded on counterterrorism, Iraqi disarmament, Arab-Israeli peace, and support for homegrown economic and political reform. While each of these goals is important, none should be made hostage to the others or tackled a la carte. We must pursue all four simultaneously with consistent long-range strategies that build on existing efforts by peoples and governments in the region. This will not be easy. If we are to succeed, we must be clear-eyed about the region and its realities and understand that paralysis is the enemy of stability. We have to pay careful attention to our most important bilateral relationships, but also be willing to speak plain truth to our friends as well as our adversaries. We must be clear not only about what we stand against, but also what we stand for. Most of all, we must understand that we can only support, not supplant, the ongoing efforts by the peoples and leaderships of the region themselves to remove the obstacles to hope. With these thoughts in mind, let me sketch briefly our approach to each of the four issues that I mentioned. First, the war against terror. In the wake of the September 11th terrorist attacks, President Bush made plain once again our rejection of the notion that any political cause can justify the taking of innocent life. In doing so, he spoke not only for the American people, but for all the peoples of the civilized world. Since that day, President Bush has assembled and led the international coalition that liberated Afghanistan. With our partners, we are continuing to employ every resource at our disposal: political, diplomatic, financial, intelligence, law enforcement, and military, to eliminate the scourge of global terrorism. This is a war against violent extremism, not against Islam or the Arab world. The terrorists of 9/11, the terrorists of Bali, and others like them are the enemies of Arabs and Muslims. They have defiled a great religion in a vain effort to sanction their crimes. Our friends in the Middle East have a particularly important stake in this war. Many have experienced terrorism, and all have seen the threat it poses to stability, society, and progress. They have risen to the challenge and play important roles in the global coalition. Many have extended basing rights for Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan, exchanged intelligence and law enforcement information, and clamped down on terrorist financing. Terrorists murder more than people. They murder hope. When we join with our friends in the Middle East to fight terrorism, we join with them to pave the way to a more hopeful future. Second, Iraq. The countries of the region, our friends and allies, and the community of nations also face a real and increasingly dangerous threat from the Iraqi regime of Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein has been a menace to his own people for more than 2 decades. He has led Iraq into 2 disastrous wars, used chemical weapons against Iraqi women and children, and brought to bear every form of repressive state terror imaginable. Saddam is also a threat beyond his borders. 11 years ago, the United Nations demanded that Baghdad relinquish its weapons of mass destruction. Saddam agreed, but since then has met the Security Council resolutions with deception, denial, and evasion. Saddam's continued defiance of these resolutions is a provocation to all members of the United Nations. That is why President Bush appeared before the UN General Assembly on September 12th and challenged the UN to see its obligations enforced. And that is why, after a great deal of hard work by the President and Secretary Powell, the UN Security Council voted unanimously earlier today for a strong new resolution offering Iraq a final opportunity to meet its obligations. The Iraqi regime can either disarm or be disarmed. The choice is theirs, but it can no longer be postponed. The Iraqi people deserve peace, prosperity, and freedom. The world's peoples deserve security from the grave and gathering danger posed by the Iraqi regime. With today's resolution, we have all taken a step closer to hope. Terrorism and violence are roadblocks to a hopeful future, nowhere more so than for Palestinians and Israelis. Let me be very clear. The only way to open a practical pathway to that more hopeful future is to end terror and violence. There is simply no other way. Over the past year, I have spent many months traveling in the Middle East. I have seen for myself the anger and the frustration of Israeli and Palestinian mothers and fathers. I have seen for myself the terrible destruction inside Jenin refugee camp and the horrific aftermath of suicide bombings in Jerusalem. And I have seen something less tangible, but no less troubling, the collapse of faith in a better future, in which two states, Israel and Palestine, live side by side in peace, security, and dignity. There has been too much suffering and too much death. Palestinians and Israelis deserve better than that. They deserve a future where Israelis no longer worry about whether their children will return safely from school, a future that preserves Israel as a strong and vibrant and democratic Jewish state. They also deserve a future without occupation and settlement construction activity, a future that stops the daily humiliations of life under occupation and brings Palestinians a viable democratic state of their own. As President Bush has emphasized, we believe firmly that there can be no peace for either side in the Middle East without freedom for both sides. The road to such a future is very difficult, and moving forward will require vision and compassion from leaders, along with the courage to speak plain truths to their peoples. It will require the international community to impart a sense of purpose, determination, and generosity. And peace will require ordinary people on both sides, mothers, teachers, laborers, business people, to reject violence and hatred and demand a political path to a more hopeful future. It is in this spirit that President Bush outlined a clear vision of peace last June 24th, and it is in this spirit that he has instructed us to construct a practical pathway that over the next 3 years can realize that vision, working closely with the Israelis and the Palestinians and with our partners in the Quartet, Russia, the European Union, and the United Nations, and in the region, especially Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan. We have been consulting on a draft roadmap to do just that over 3 phases. The first phase is predicated, most importantly, on an end to the violence and terror which has inflicted such enormous pain on innocent people and done so much damage to the legitimate aspirations of Palestinians. The simple truth is that terror and violence is a road to disaster for everyone. Alongside that maximum effort to stop terror, there must also be immediate progress to alleviate the suffering of Palestinian citizens and restore a sense of hope and dignity. President Bush has made clear that this means return of tax revenue withheld by Israel to responsible Palestinian hands. It also means stopping all Israeli settlement activity, including the natural growth of existing settlements, consistent with the Mitchell report of last year. As calm is restored, Israeli forces must withdraw from Palestinian areas, and the status quo that existed in September of 2000 must be restored, further allowing normal Palestinian life to resume. The Palestinians have a profound self-interest in laying the groundwork for a viable independent state by reforming their institutions and transforming their leadership. It is also in their interest to move ahead quickly with their plans to draft a progressive democratic constitution and prepare carefully for elections. All of these steps must ultimately come from within, and Palestinians must have the space and the encouragement to carry them out. Once these elements are in place, an international conference would launch the second phase, aimed at the possibility of establishing a Palestinian state with provisional borders as a way station to a permanent two-state solution. The third and final phase would be negotiations between Israel and Palestine on a permanent status agreement that ends their conflict once and for all. This Palestinian-Israeli peace will in turn be part of a broader effort, built also on the familiar foundation of Madrid and Security Council resolutions 242, 338, and 1397, to seek a comprehensive peace between Israel and all its neighbors, including Syria and Lebanon. Every state in the region has a vital stake in this undertaking, and no government can shirk its responsibility to help. That is why President Bush applauded Saudi Crown Prince Abdullah's initiative, endorsed by the Arab League summit in Beirut last spring, and that is why no state genuinely committed to peace can harbor extremist groups who murder civilians. Comprehensive peace can never be achieved through violence. Some argue that now is not the time for roadmaps, that there is no hope for progress toward a permanent settlement. I don't believe that. I'm not naive. The obstacles seem enormous right now, but we have to get started, because if we're not moving forward, history suggests that we can slide back disastrously. All parties will have to meet their responsibilities if we're to make any progress, but President Bush has made clear that the United States will play an active leadership role. As important as it is to fight terrorism, ensure that Iraq disarms, and achieve Arab-Israeli peace, these are by no means the only challenges faced by the peoples and leaderships of the Middle East. They also confront enormous economic and political obstacles to hope. The facts are sobering. Per capita incomes throughout the Middle East are stagnant or dropping. Growth is lagging, even as the labor force keeps growing. 45% of the population of the Arab world is now under the age of 14, and the population of the region as a whole will double over the next quarter century. Middle Eastern economies are not equipped to handle the surge of young people into the job market. The region's share of world GDP, trade, and foreign investment continues to shrink. Most of the region's economies suffer from a lack of transparency, weak capital markets, barriers to trade, and a workforce lacking modern skills. Regional investors have already shifted more than $1 trillion in investments outside the Middle East. Given the high stakes, we must do all we can to support those who are working to open up their economies and expand opportunities for all their citizens. While there is no single model for change, we must be strong advocates for enhancing private sector involvement, diversifying economies, and educating children to compete in the modern global economy. Greater economic openness cannot exist in a vacuum. Open economies require open and accommodating political systems. The invisible hand of economic choice and vitality only works if it is truly free to function. Today, however, many political systems in the region fail to give voice to their citizens. Political structures all too often serve to insulate the regime and governing elite from change. As a result, societies become brittle and resistant to peaceful, gradual change. When dissent is equated with disloyalty, dissenters are forced underground. The mosques become politicized when Hamas or Hezbollah is the only outlet for alternative voices. The good news is that the peoples of the region are beginning to take action. More and more citizens are organizing to play a role in their societies. From the Persian Gulf to the Straits of Gibraltar, we see women, journalists, trade unionists, and educators mobilizing to have a say within the system in ways that fit their societies and their cultures. Some political systems, too, are starting to open up. We hope that the recent elections in Bahrain, in which women voted and ran for office, are a harbinger of expanded popular participation. As these examples show, I'm not saying anything that the peoples of the Middle East don't already know for themselves. We pretend to know monopoly on wisdom on these issues, and I've always thought a little humility goes a long way in the exercise of American power and purpose in the Middle East. The truth is that the people of the Middle East don't need preaching about their problems. They need support for their own efforts to move into a better future, and they will have it. At President Bush's direction, Secretary Powell has taken the lead in organizing an initiative to work with those in the region who are committed to broadening economic opportunities, expanding political participation, and better educating young people. This initiative is committed to genuine, two-way partnership in each of these three areas. We are working hard with partners in the region as well as with Congress to develop this effort, which Secretary Powell will address in more detail in the coming months. With this initiative, we will assist actions by Arab countries to open up their economies, finance entrepreneurs, and participate more fully in the world trading system. Countries like Saudi Arabia want to join the World Trade Organization, and we are determined to help. With others like Morocco, Bahrain, and Egypt, we are exploring ways of expanding trade ties and following in the footsteps of our free trade agreement with Jordan, which I was proud to support as our ambassador in Amman. At the same time, we will support efforts to strengthen political participation, especially by women. Earlier this week, in fact, Secretary Powell met with a delegation of women leaders from across the Arab world who visited the United States to learn campaign skills and observe our election process. The enthusiasm and the seriousness of those women leaders was inspiring and offered a vivid reminder of what's possible if the human potential of the region is given free rein. And we will work with educators and parents to help prepare young people for the challenges of the 21st century. We recognize the need to remain open to Arab and Muslim students, even as we balance homeland security requirements. We cannot afford to lose touch with a whole generation of young Muslims and Arabs, and we do not intend to do so. What I have suggested here amounts to what is probably the most challenging undertaking that we and our partners in the region have ever considered. We should be realistic about the obstacles on the road ahead, about the time it will take to see real change evolve, and about the limited role that outsiders can play. But we should also avoid resigning ourselves to low expectations. As demonstrated by the 2002 Arab Human Development Report, the peoples of the Middle East themselves are seized with these issues. For the United States, it is deeply in our interest to encourage these long-term structural changes. Most of these challenges are outside our control, but none is beyond our influence. Here again, the Arab Human Development Report is important because it outlines an Arab agenda for hope, an agenda we can and will support. Ladies and gentlemen, anger and frustration do stalk the Middle East today, but they do not walk alone. Alongside the shadows of despair, there are also some glimmers of hope. I have never forgotten the buzz of optimism of that day 11 years ago in Madrid, despite all the twists, turns, and downward spirals since then. And I have come away from my travels in the region with the conviction that the peoples of the Middle East want a hope and are ready to take the steps necessary to rekindle hope. The agenda which I've tried to describe this afternoon is hard-nosed about the threats posed by terror and Iraq's refusal thus far to disarm. It is, or at least I hope it is, clear-eyed about what we have at stake in the Middle East and how hard it will be to achieve Arab-Israeli peace and help people in the region deal with some very real economic and political challenges. But it is also an agenda that is fundamentally optimistic an agenda that speaks to what is best about us as Americans and what is best about the individual human beings who live in the Middle East today. None of the issues on our agenda are easy, but it is profoundly important to pursue all of them with all the energy and the determination that we can muster. Thank you very much.
We thank you very much for what was I think, unusually clear and encouraging and comprehensive outline of the substance and spirit of our policy in the Middle East. Professor Friedman.
I'm most interested in the evolution of U.S. policy from April of this year to the June 24th statement. In April, the President of the United States was pushing Israel to rapidly withdraw. Then he seemed to back off, and for those of us who are academics, we play with different theories. One said it was domestic politics, the Jewish lobby, the Christian evangelicals. Others said it was a repetition of Palestinian terrorism, which finally convinced the president for change. Others said it was the Iraqi issue. So I wonder if you could just take us through from sort of April 4th until the June 24th speech as to how our policy evolved.
I'd be glad to. And I guess what I'd stress at the outset, Professor Friedman, is what I think are truly the elements of continuity in the president's approach. Because the president has made very clear repeatedly over recent months that both sides are going to have obligations. If we're going to be able to help and others in the international community are going to be able to help to move away from the terror and violence that have done so much to undermine the legitimate aspirations of Palestinians back toward a political process, because that's the only way in which the vision that he's talked about before the UN more than a year ago of two states, Israel and Palestine, living side by side, is ever going to emerge. It is an enormous challenge to get both sides to face up to those obligations, but as I tried to stress in my remarks, terror and violence is what has to be addressed first and foremost. And it's the continuation of the efforts by extremists to undermine any hope for the resumption of a political process that has made it so extraordinarily difficult to move ahead. The president has been equally clear about the obligations that the government of Israel has in order to address the immediate humanitarian concerns of Palestinians, about which he feels very deeply. And I gave a couple of examples in my remarks. One is the return of tax revenues. The Israeli government for the last 2 years has withheld something on the order of $600 million in tax revenues. And we have worked hard to put in place a responsible mechanism so that we can have confidence that that money is restored to a Ministry of Finance in Palestine, in the Palestinian Authority, that is going to use that money properly. But again, the living conditions that Palestinians face are extremely difficult, and they're getting worse, and those are issues also that have to be addressed. At the same time, we've tried to, particularly since the President's June 24 speech, lay out a kind of practical pathway to take the elements that the President proposed in that very important speech and describe in detail what are the kind of steps that could move us in that direction. And they include what I mentioned before, first and foremost, serious efforts against terror and violence to restore security, to stabilize the situation, serious efforts to ease the humanitarian conditions of Palestinians, serious efforts at building sound Palestinian institutions, not as an end in themselves, but in preparation for statehood. And those are things that are very much in the self-interest of Palestinians. They're not a favor to us or to the Israelis or to anyone else. And so it's those elements that we're trying to lay out in a practical pathway to move forward. Again, it's going to require a great deal of commitment and political will from the parties themselves in very difficult circumstances. But I think the United States, and I know the President and Secretary Powell believe that the United States has a very important leadership role to play in trying to speak some plain truths to all sides on these issues.
My name is Om Bansal, and the question I have, I've been in this country for over 30 years, but lately, in the last few years particularly, I see there are problems which are very similar in nature. For example, you have North Korea on this side, which has a problem, which we know all that. Now we know Iraq has a problem, and we know the Palestine and Israeli has a problem. And I guess if America has to take a lead in that, then we should have a consistent policies. On one hand, we want to attack Iraq, for example. We're not saying anything about North Korea. And as Professor Friedman mentioned, I think Palestine has a right. I'm not a Palestinian, I'm not a Muslim, so don't get me wrong here, but I think it is overdue. If Israel can be created by a UN vote, I think Palestine can be created by a UN vote also. So if America has to take a lead, I think our policy should be consistent. And I don't know what to say. Maybe you have something to say on that regard. Like our Secretary, Mr. Powell, was very much in the news. But for last 5, 6 months, 4 months, whatever that may be, I have not seen him in the news. I mean, you just mentioned a few things that he went here or there or whatever, but no news about it. So I guess my question here is, we as a country, maybe we are aligning on some friends which we don't know what they can do, like Pakistan, for example. I know US supported Pakistan. They are the one who supported Osama bin Laden. They created the problem. Now we think they are solving the problem for us. I think they are creating further. While we ignoring altogether a country which is next to it, India, which is highly democratic, we don't want to seek the support from them.
What I tried to outline to you, I think, is an approach in which the President and Secretary Powell are quite determined to try and address a whole range of issues. The Palestinian-Israeli issue with as much creativity and activism as we can bring to bear. The Iraq issue, where, again, we've tried, as the President has made clear since September, to work as carefully and actively as we can through the Security Council to build the strongest possible international coalition to hold Iraq to its obligations to disarm. And the longer-term structural challenges that I mentioned are in some ways harder to get a grip on. But there again, I think we have a profound interest as a society in helping peoples in the region to address those kind of challenges. The initiative is going to have to come from them, but we're beginning to see some signs that people realize the challenges before them. And I think it's very much in our interest to provide whatever support we can. I don't think the United States has the luxury of sitting back from any of these issues, nor do we have the luxury of simply pursuing them, as I mentioned earlier, a la carte, kind of one at a time. We are the last remaining superpower. We have to muster the resources and the wherewithal to put forth each of the issues before us in the Middle East, because in many respects they are connected. And it's a question of beginning to rebuild a sense of hope for people in the region, not naively, because all of these problems are extremely difficult. And there are going to be any number of setbacks along the way. But again, I think it's profoundly important for us to engage on all of them.
Should, against all expectation, Iraq disarm and agree to the resolution, can war be averted, or is the momentum for regime change so strong that even if he does give full and immediate compliance, another pretext can and ought to be found for eliminating his regime?
The President's been very clear about 2 points that I'll make in response. The first is we continue to believe that our friends in the region, that the international community, that the people of Iraq would be better off with a different regime in Baghdad. The President's been very clear about that. Secondly, he's also been very clear, however, that if the Iraqi regime complies fully with its obligations to the Security Council, which are specified very clearly in the resolution which was voted on unanimously earlier today, then in effect that regime will have changed. It'll have changed its behavior and everything else, and that's where the President has left it.
Mr. Burns.
Yes, sir.
It seems that the Israelis and Palestinians might never reach an agreement left to themselves, especially, as you mentioned, the primary thing being the terrorism. It's just an endless cycle, one responding to the other. And especially as long as the Israeli Likud party and right wing remain in control. Do you foresee a point that the U.S. must step in and impose a settlement resulting in 2 states, perhaps along the structure and borders of the Mitchell Plan, and probably enforced by a U.S. military peacekeeping force? Thank you.
Let me just say a couple of things in response. First, you're absolutely right that the United States is going to have to play a very active role, along with others in the international community, and we try to work very closely with the European Union, with Russia, with the United Nations and the so-called Quartet, as well as with partners in the region. But left to their own devices, I think the history of the last couple of years suggests that it's going to be extremely difficult for Israelis and Palestinians to move decisively back toward a political process. So the role of third parties, and particularly the role of the United States, given our special relationship with Israel, given our connections elsewhere in the region, is going to be critically important. I absolutely agree with you on that. Second, I don't think it's ever going to be possible to put together or to reassemble a sustainable political process if it's imposed. I think that the impetus for change is going to have to come from peoples and leaderships in the region. A combination, therefore, of a very strong, active, energetic, creative outside involvement, especially by the United States, is an indispensable ingredient. But it has to be combined with a sense of purpose on the part of peoples and leaderships in the region as well. And I think if you look at public opinion polls that are done in both Israel and amongst Palestinians, it's very interesting to see some of the results. In Israel, for example, you have consistently 70% plus of people supporting the toughest possible measures against terror and violence. And yet that same 70% plus of people talk quite clearly about their understanding that a two-state solution is the only enduring positive outcome for both Israelis and Palestinians. And with Palestinians, you see a kind of similar schizophrenia sometimes. So that the potential is there, I believe, to be tapped into. It is going to be extremely hard to do, and we're going to have to play a very active role if we're going to have any hope of doing it.
Given the high level of distrust, intransigence, and intractability between Sharon and Arafat, is it possible, in your opinion, to ever achieve some modus vivendi with the present leadership on both sides? That's one question. And the second question, very briefly also, is given an optimal resolution of the major problems of the settlements, the law of return, the Jerusalem, will there ever, in your opinion, in our lifetime, ever really see a true peace between Israel and the Palestinians, or is it such a strong feeling amongst some of the Palestinians that under any circumstances they do not want to see Israel in the Middle East, a viable Israel in the Middle East?
I'm convinced that it is possible in our lifetimes to see that kind of an outcome, to see an outcome in which two states, Israel and Palestine, live side by side, and even an outcome in which the Arab states accept Israel as a normal part of the neighborhood, as the democratic Jewish state that it is. And I think it's interesting to see, and I'm not exaggerating and I'm certainly not naive, but if you look back at some of the developments of the last year, the initiative that the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia put together, in which he talked for the first time quite explicitly about acceptance of Israel as a normal part of the region, as part of a comprehensive peace settlement, using language that many Arab states and the Saudis themselves had shied away from before. That doesn't suggest that peace is around the corner. It doesn't suggest that it's going to be easy. But it suggests that I think more and more people in the region, especially Palestinians and Israelis, despite all the bitterness and the anger and the violence and the bloodshed of the last couple of years, do understand that an enduring outcome is going to require those two states to exist side by side. Your first question about leaderships in the region. President Bush has been very clear in expressing his views about the failings of the Palestinian leadership. And what we've tried to emphasize, without focusing on any one individual, is the importance for Palestinians themselves of building sound institutions in preparation for statehood, institutions which don't depend on one person or one group of people, institutions which Palestinians are perfectly capable of building. They're as capable as any Arab society I've known of building those kind of institutions. And they've charted that course themselves. It was the Palestinian parliament which told Arafat several months ago, you need to change your cabinet, that we're dissatisfied with the way governance has proceeded. We're dissatisfied with corruption. Palestinians don't need us to tell them that. They realize that for themselves, and they're beginning to move in that direction. And that kind of an effort, I believe, deserves our support and the support of others. Because in the end, you do need to have a system of leadership that gives people confidence. You need to have a system of leadership which is willing to speak plain truths to people and that understands the importance of moving back to dialogue in a political process. And you need that kind of leadership on all sides if we're going to get any place.
What's the administration's response to our Arab allies when they express concern that they may be the next targets of the U.S. drive for democratization?
Well, the response is what I tried to describe before. In other words, it seems to me that first point is that there are enormous challenges that people in the region face in terms of opening up their economies, being able to compete in the global economy as well as politically, finding a way in which all of their citizens can participate, have a say in the way in which decisions are made. And those economic and political systems, it seems to me, are connected. You look any place else in the world, and they are very much connected. This is not so much a question, as I tried to emphasize, of the United States preaching to people, of the United States dictating outcomes, of the United States offering up only one model of moving ahead. You know, we're proud as a society of what we've achieved in our political system, and it hasn't come without a lot of pain and a lot of difficulties along the way. In many ways, I think the most powerful role we can play in the Middle East now is by our example. Because it's not a coincidence that there are lots and lots of young Arabs and Muslims who want to come to this country to study. It's because they see something positive in the values which make our society stand out. Now, they're not going to apply those values necessarily in exactly the same way. And they're going to have to wrestle with the choices that are involved in opening up political participation. And the kind of efforts that result from that are sometimes going to be very fitful, with 2 steps forward and 1 3/4 steps backward. But I think it's very important for the United States to support those efforts where they exist. And that, again, it's not so much a function, as you suggested in your question, of dictating to people or of outsiders pretending that they have all the answers. We don't. And the only way in which you're going to sustain progress is not by imposing it from the outside, but by having genuine roots develop from the inside. There are things we can do to help, and I tried to outline some of them. But I think as you look out over the next 5 or 10 years, harnessing the tools that we have at our disposal to help those efforts in the region is going to be as important as anything else on our agenda. But thank you for the question.
Now is Ramadan, so for 30 days or so, there'll be an interesting time. The Israelis now are going to probably have elections in January. That gives 3 months. They will be looking at what's happening on the ground from the Palestinian side. The Palestinians also will have to have elections. What happens in the Israeli elections are going to depend on what the Palestinians are going to be doing over the next 3 months. Is that the key thing now, or?
I think for Palestinians, it's sometimes easy to underestimate the influence that their behavior has on the way in which ordinary Israelis look at developments and look at what's possible. It seems to me, as both Israelis and Palestinians consider political decisions, with entirely their business and not the business of outsiders, that it becomes all the more important for people who are genuinely committed to peace, people who understand that what needs to be done, the difficult things that need to be done to move in that direction, the steps that need to be taken against terror and violence, the steps that need to be taken to recognize the humanity of the human beings on both sides, the compromises that ultimately are going to be required if both peoples are going to have security and dignity. It seems to me more important than ever that people be willing not just to speak about those things, but to act in a way which shows their commitment to that kind of a future. And again, that's not a favor to the United States or to outsiders. It's fundamentally in the self-interest of both peoples themselves.
As the U.S. is the sole superpower in the world today, it seems to me our mission should be helping developing countries, not to wage wars. Afghanistan government, as of now, is pretty much limited to Kabul. We haven't finished in Afghanistan. The rest of the country is pretty wild with tribes in the north and so on. That's one to be done. We're still in Bosnia, we're still in Kosovo. Now, the UN resolutions relative to Israel and Palestine, we have completely neglected. We seem to be pushing on the ones that Iraq has disobeyed, but not the ones that said the two countries should go back to '67. We wouldn't be in the situation we are today had we done that. And I haven't heard anything about that. Now, and I might say, I think the description now is that the Palestinian situation is similar to what the blacks had in South Africa. It's an apartheid, basically, because they're completely controlled. Now, we also, I believe, we supplied weapons to Iraq when they were fighting Iran. This is the Iraq we want to go to war with now. We were shot with our own bullets, I think, in the Persian Gulf War. Now, I want to get down to what questions. Why not clean up our present war efforts before we engage in another one? Why not do something more toward helping developing countries? What is the reason that the terrorism seems to be directed so much at the U.S.? We recognize that, we're concerned with it, but why did it happen? What was our posture in the world? Are we too arrogant? Are we disregarding other countries? I'd like the discussion on that.
First, with regard to Iraq, as the President made clear again today, there's nothing inevitable or imminent about war. What the Security Council just did is to offer what is very clearly a last opportunity, but a real opportunity for the Iraqi regime to disarm or to be disarmed. And the fact that you had a unanimous vote in the Security Council, I think, sends the strongest possible message to Baghdad. We'll see how they respond. Second, I think you're right about the issue of development, about the issue of us doing what we can, and we don't have all the answers, but doing what we can to help peoples in the region, particularly in the Middle East, to cope with what are some enormously difficult structural problems, social, economic, political. And we have to do that even as we pursue a very sober and cold-eyed policy toward Iraq, along with others in the international community. And at the same time, as I said before, we have to pursue with the same seriousness the issue of Palestinians and Israelis and the broader Arab-Israeli conflict. Now, you're right, there have been a number of resolutions over the years having to do with the Arab-Israeli conflict in the UN Security Council, a number to do with Iraq. And we, as a matter of principle, are committed to implementing and following through on all of them. But what implementation means with regard to Iraq, and again made very clear by this morning's resolution, is quite straightforward. It means Iraq meeting its obligations, in particular to disarm weapons of mass destruction. With regard to the Arab-Israeli conflict, what it means is taking two sets of concerns and interests and setting up a negotiating process that can reconcile them and produce a political outcome. And over the years, we've seen some results. Egypt and Israel reached a peace treaty based on that same construct. They moved ahead in order to implement resolutions 242 and 338. Israel and Jordan reached a similar peace treaty. Israelis and Palestinians reached some interim agreements along the way. You're absolutely right. There's an enormous amount left to do. And the longer it takes to begin to get traction again on those issues, the more difficult it's going to be for all of us, I think.
I've just been told that the vote was not unanimous, that it was 14 to 15, so anyone who knows about that, I'd love to know. But my question is, having just returned from Republic of South Africa and being familiar with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I do understand the difference between confession and obstinance. But I'm wondering, if you were to reread your scripted speech, in what parts, other than that, could you not simply substitute the word North Korea for Iraq?
Well, I think what distinguishes the two cases, first, we got...
Other than admission by North Korea.
Other than?
Other than admission by North Korea of its weaponry.
Right. Well, I think first the use of weapons of mass destruction against its own people, which Iraq has done, using chemical weapons, which resulted in the deaths of estimated at least 5,000 people, Kurds in northern Iraq. The fact that Iraq in recent years has launched 2 wars against 2 of its neighbors, tried to occupy and essentially destroy a neighboring Arab state in Kuwait 11 years ago. So, I mean, I think if you look at the specific behavior of the Iraqi regime, there's real cause for concern. And that's what's driven the Security Council to vote as clearly and strongly as it did earlier today to hold Iraq to its obligations. That doesn't mean that we ought not to be seriously concerned about North Korea. Of course we are, and the President's been very clear about that. But the approach that the President is taking has to be tailored to the particular case. In the case of Iraq, there are some particular and I think unique threats that the Iraqi regime has posed to the region and to its own people in recent years. And that history has to be a part of how we approach the problem. And that's why we've gone back to the Security Council. That's why the President has charted as clear a course as he had. And we are going to move with equal resolution on the question of North Korea, but it doesn't necessarily follow that the tactics and the approach are going to be identical in each case.
It's interesting that you're talking about the relativity of various regions and the way they approach these problems, because we do know that China and Taiwan are trying to work things out, and North Korea is working things out with Japan and China. Now, my question to you is, in the Palestinian situation, have you seen incrementally the establishment of what would be a more democratic society within the PA? And then I want to ask you, what part could Jordan, Egypt, and Syria play in providing stability to Palestine so that Israel can make some kind of peace with them?
Palestinians have made some progress in creating those institutions. Most recently, a new Minister of Finance was appointed, who has a very professional, accomplished veteran of the International Monetary Fund, who's done a great deal to rebuild confidence in the way in which Palestinians manage public finances. Still a lot of work to do, but I think that's one area where we have seen some progress. I would also point to the Palestinian Legislative Council, which in some ways, in a way that's rare in that part of the world, the part of the world I've been talking about, spoke out in recent months quite openly and quite vociferously against corruption and in favor of better governance. And in one instance, created a great deal of pressure to change a cabinet and to move in some ministers who are more capable and more honest and more professional in their approach to things. Is that the end of the story? Of course not. There's an enormous amount remaining to be done. I think Palestinians, though, as a people and as a society, are entirely capable of making those changes. Part of it probably has to do with their, long interaction, both painful as well as hopeful, with Israelis over the last 50 years. There's a sense of how a vibrant democratic system can work. And I think when you look at which societies in the Middle East are most capable of both developing and then building those institutions, I think the Palestinians would be at or near the top of my list. But there's a lot more that can be done. Can neighbors help them in that process? Of course. And some of the neighbors, of course, have many of their own challenges in terms of building those institutions. But economics is one example. If you look at Jordan and the Palestinians, for example, there's a great deal that both can gain but through economic cooperation. And I think that's the kind of thing that helps give people a greater incentive to move back toward a political process.
What do you think about the Israeli emphasis now on the need for Arafat to go?
President Bush, which is what I can speak for, has been very clear in expressing his views about the performance of the Palestinian leadership. But I think the broader point is the one I tried to make before, and that's not to focus so much on particular personalities, but on creating the kinds of institutions that don't depend on one individual or one group of individuals. The kind of institutions that'll give people on both sides real hope that a two-state solution is going to produce the best future for both of them. And that's why I think it's so important for us to support, and others in the international community, to support Palestinian efforts to build those kind of institutions.
We have reached the end of the session. I'd like to thank our guest for informing us so clearly and well, and truly honoring us for joining us today. We're indeed grateful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.